Hello Internet, welcome to Collective Arcana. We are a channel all about tabletop gaming. My name is Wyatt, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about feats and RP and improvising in your game. Hey everybody, before we get going, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps out the channel, lets us know when we're doing a good job, and lets us know the types of content you want to see. So there are a lot of people that think that if a feat exists, it means that you cannot do the thing that the feat allows you to do at all. I do not prescribe to this theory. In fact, I would say that the existence of a feat does not preclude the ability to perform the actions contained in the feat without having the feat. All the feat is doing is guaranteeing you a path to do the thing that you want to do. What do I mean by that? Well, say for instance, you have a situation where you want to calm down a crowd of villagers, bar fight, whatever it may be. And your GM says, okay, roll a check, uses the set DCs, either the simple or the, by level, whatever it is. Sets a DC, has you roll a check, you do really well on the check. Oh yeah, everyone calms down. No problem there. There is a feat, though, that would allow you to do exactly that, called No Cause for Alarm. It can calm down a crowd. And it even states in the feat at what levels and ranks you can affect how many creatures. So does that completely invalidate the other ability? No. No, it just means that if you were in a situation where you wanted to do that, and your GM says, I know this crowd's pretty rowdy, you could say, but I can definitely do it. I've got the feat. Feat says I can do it. And the GM would be like, oh, you're right. Sorry. Yeah. So even in a situation where your GM may not allow you or may not instinctively think that, yeah, you could calm this crowd down, you can say, I can calm any crowd down. I've got this feat. Is that a bit of a stretch? I don't think so. We already know that in the core rulebook, it's recommended if a GM or whoever doesn't know a rule or doesn't want to take the time to look up a rule, you can just set a DC and move on from there. Roll whatever checks are needed. So it's in the rules for you to not know or have all of the rules handy. Therefore, it's assumed that sometimes there will be things that may be covered by a feat or a special rule you don't know about that you're just going to roll a check. And that's okay. I mean, in page 7 of the rulebook, first rule, and this is, whatever system you're using, it might be called the golden rule, rule 0, the first rule, whatever it is. Very few, especially modern RPGs, are going to tell you that you have to do everything exactly as the book tells you. That's A, no fun at all. It's B, it's unrealistic. It's something that very few people are going to run a book exactly as printed. And that's okay. That's the point of these games, right? I mean, if I wanted to play a game that had a set bunch of rules that I have to follow exactly, I would go play a video game. I mean, it's fun to jump around and be an assassin in Assassin's Creed, climbing buildings, jumping down, setting ships on fire, whatever it is. But I just don't have the freedom that I would have in a game. Forget the fact that, collaboration and, specific mechanics that may exist or whatever, but I just don't have the free reign to do everything. I mean, how many times have you been in a game and you just want to climb a ladder or jump over like a 3-foot ledge or something and you can't? So that's what I'm talking about. In RPGs, that does not exist. If you see a thing, you will have some way to affect that thing. If something's going on, you will have some way to interact with scenery, creatures, whatever situation. Sometimes you will have a very specific rule that you can use. Sometimes you will have a very specific feat that you can point to and use. Sometimes you may not. But again, having a feat saying specifically that in these situations you can do these things does not mean that over here on the other side and another table or even another person at the table who doesn't have your feat cannot do something at least similar to what you're doing. And hey, look, some feats are clearly solidly mechanical feats. They just have set rules that I don't think anybody's really going to argue against the types of feats that say, oh, you move an extra 10 feet whenever you roll a climb or a swim or whatever it is. Most people are going to say, oh yeah, I understand that's a feat. I don't have that feat. I move at these speeds that are already set. We're talking about things that are a little bit more amorphous, things that are changing how or when you get to use your abilities or exactly how your abilities may interact with the situation. So let's talk about some examples of what I do mean. We've referenced the no cause for alarm feat earlier. There's also lie to me, which is if you successfully roll a success on a lie, you may influence an NPC, their disposition towards you. Sow rumor is another big one that you'll see a lot, where people might say, well, why can't I just sow a rumor? Why do I need a feat to sow a rumor? You don't. You don't need that feat. If your character is going around saying, oh, hey, the king does this, and he's succeeding in his checks to convince people that the king does this, they're sowing a rumor. But so rumor has some specifics on how it works, and most importantly, it's guaranteeing you the ability to do that. Versus your GM saying, it doesn't matter how hard you try to convince these people, they're just not going to buy it, that the king is secretly a lizard person. That's crazy. Is it, though? But if you have a feat like sow rumor, there's not a lot the GM can say there. So again, you aren't necessarily buying the way to do it with the feat. You aren't saying that this is the only way this can be done. You're buying a guarantee. You're buying whether it's a shortcut, whether it's a convenient, easy to remember mechanic, whatever it is, you're pointing to that and saying, I can do this. It does not rely on GM fiat. It does not rely on your GM being in a good mood or thinking that you made a good argument about why you could do a thing. You can just do the thing. I mean, going back to Charming Liar, if you tell a lie and you convince someone that, you rescued their son when their son was traveling abroad, that NPC there's a good chance that NPC is going to like you a little bit better whether you have the Charming Liar feat or not. It's just situational. It's up to GM's discretion there. But by having that Charming Liar feat, you can be like, oh no, I'm lovable. This guy's eating out of the palm of my hand. And that's how a lot of these things work. They're taking things that your GM may allow you to do with a really good, favorable situation or conditions or a really high roll. And they're saying you don't have to get a really high roll to calm this whole crowd down. These are rules for how you can do it. But again, it doesn't necessarily say that in a moment, if it makes sense for the story, that your character couldn't get a bunch of NPCs to calm down. The other thing is that a lot of times, if you're trying to do something that seems really cool, your GM may set a pretty high DC for you to hit. That GM may say, I don't really know how this works. This seems really powerful. I don't know the rule for it. I don't necessarily want this to be something that's easy for them to do. So let me set this check high. Now, a lot of these feats are going to be set against either the NPC that you're dealing with or against a pretty standard on-level DC. Some of them will even specifically call out easy feats or easy DCs. Now, to be fair, some will specifically call out difficult DCs. But nonetheless, most of these feats are going to be relatively achievable on the checks they're asking you to roll. And again, they're going to have clearly defined critical fail, success, and critical success ranges. So again, you're buying expectations, you're buying guarantees, you're buying clear-cut things that you can be certain about in terms of what your character can and cannot do, instead of relying on situations, GM fiat, GM wanting to yes and roll with whatever you're saying. You can sort of influence, not in the way, unlike the way that a pretty rules-like game like Fate, for example, talks about how you can use your fate points to control the narrative and make rules about a scene. You're just using these feats to make rules about a scene. It doesn't mean that, for a fire, to take a great example right out of the rule book in Fate, doesn't mean that the fire cannot spread on its own. It just means that by using a fate point, you can say, yes, the fire has begun to spread in this room. And, regardless of what this bad guy wants to do to me, we both need to get out of here right now. It allows you to take control of the narrative. And that's all these feats are doing. They're just giving you tools as a player to take control of the narrative and say, no, my character's good at this, my character can do this thing, and I'm going to do it. And a lot of you have probably seen this or done this in your games. If not necessarily for skill feats and skill checks and things like that, there's a really good chance at every table, at least once, some of this will happen in combat. And that may seem crazy, like, No, you don't get to do things in combat without having clear-cut feats and abilities to do them in combat. Especially not in a game with so many feats like Pathfinder. If you don't have the feat, you can't do it. So let's play out a couple of scenarios, right? Let's say there's a bar fight and your fighter picks up a stool and she swings it at a drunken patron at the bar. Now, your fighter has not picked up any tools to be good at improvised weapons. Your GM may not even look up rules for how much damage a stool should deal. There are rules for that. They exist. But the GM doesn't want to take the time to figure out how much stools deal or how much hardness does a table have to stop someone, shooting arrows at you, whatever it may be. Instead, your GM might just say, okay, pick it up, roll an attack, don't add your item bonus from your sword, or, roll an unarmed attack and we'll hit him with the chair and he'll go flying. Your fighter knocks him out. Great. That's almost certainly happened at someone's table. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's great. That's going with the flow. That's narrative. That's fun. That's interesting. No feats were required. But there are feats to do all those things. There are rules that clearly state how much damage does a stool do. How big would your bonus be if you were trying to hit someone with a stool? What type of damage does a stool do? Or the GM can be like, it's probably bludgeoning. Swing away. I would argue that's the right way to handle that. Unless your GM has researched, really prepared for this bar fight, knew it was coming, and knows all the rules for improvised weapons, in which case, hey, go with what your GM says. They're running the game. They want you to, do whatever those rules are. Great. But if they haven't, if it's just something that happens, if it's just a situation that no one really expected or, thought needed to have a bunch of planning applied to it, just a fun little bar brawl, great. Or let's say you're in a pretty serious battle and the ranger's got a clear shot, takes that shot, rolls a critical hit, hits an ogre. Critical hit, big damage, big fun, right? The GM might say, oh, you've hit the ogre in the knee and now he's favoring that leg. And maybe he's looking a little bit slow. You don't have called shot or any mechanic that would do that. And maybe it's just flavor text and everybody moves on. Or maybe the GM does reward your very timely critical hit and, describes the ogre moving a little bit more sluggish. Maybe gives him some sort of a penalty to movement speed or even AC or whatever. Maybe they don't, but maybe they do. And I think that most tables have seen that happen, where somebody rolls really well, something really exciting happens when people thought that things were going to go really bad, and the GM just rolls with it and says, yeah, and this, and everybody has a great time. That's fine. The fact that there are rules for adding conditions and called shots, like we're seeing in the Gunslinger, like we've seen in Swashbuckler, there might be some in Ranger, I'm not sure. Actually, we'll have to check. But, these ideas that there are these mechanics for if you do these things. I know that there are some specific Ranger feats for reducing movement speed and things like that. So, does that mean you just can't do it? No, of course not. The GM thinks it's fun, it's cool, it's interesting. It's going to happen. But if you have those feats, it's guaranteed. You can say, yes, if this happens, then this happens, right? Versus, again, being down to the GM to say, oh, it was a great time to get a critical hit. It's big fun, big impactful hit. Let's roll with it. Let's say that now he's stumbling around, this ogre, and your ranger, has aided the whole party, not just by dealing this damage, but turning the tide of the fight. It's exciting. It's fun. You should do that at your table if you're not. But again, you could have the feat to let you do that. Say you've got a sorcerer, right? We're just going to do a bunch of examples now. Say you've got a sorcerer, and your sorcerer is setting off a fireball in, sort of a back alley part of town. You get ambushed, whatever it is. Well, maybe the GM says, it's a dry day, and these are straw-thatched houses. I described it earlier. Unfortunately, you have now set a house on fire. Is this an interesting complication? Yes. Is it something that's super fun? Absolutely. It's not something that Fireball specifically states, it will do. Can certainly cause explosions, but it's not something that, you didn't take a feat that says sometimes you'll catch a building on fire. You probably didn't even want to catch this building on fire, but it's still something that might happen situationally. but it's also something that a spell might do. There might be a spell that is for setting buildings on fire, specifically. But that doesn't mean that a spell like a fire trait spell like Fireball couldn't do it in the right situations. Let's do one more. We'll talk about a barbarian. Let's say you're traveling on a road and a group of bandits shows up. Barbarian wins initiative. Barbarian charges forward, lands a big crit with rage, and just chops that bandit leader right in half. First thing in the fight. There is a chance, and so I've done this, a lot of GMs have done this, where the other bandits will just, hey, oops, we shouldn't have done this, we're going to go. And that comes down to, and it's something we're going to do a video on as well about how, your monsters should have motivations and things that, they care about, things that they would and would not fight to the death for. Your purse, is probably not one of those things they would fight to the death for. And it goes in with this idea that narratively, we have seen a crazy thing happen. A bandit got chopped in half. That's wild. You don't see that every day. So then when you look over and you say, okay, well, my barbarian doesn't have, the raging intimidation feats. I don't have any of these things that would allow me to make all of these bandits run away. And your GM just looks at you and says, well, you chopped their leader in half, though, so they're going to run away. And that's sort of what I'm talking about. Just because a feat exists doesn't mean that something can't still happen narratively, that you can't still use your abilities in a fun or interesting way, that you can't think outside of the box and, make the most of these skill checks that you've invested in. It just means that you have a clear-cut way to do it regardless of whether the GM agrees with you in the moment or not about, a particular thing. And some of you may balk at that. Some of you may hate that idea of my players have this ability to, tell me how my game's going to go. It's collaborative storytelling, and you don't have to allow it. You can always, if you're, hopefully you've got enough trust at your table that you can say, hey, I know you have that ability. But narratively right now, for whatever reason, just trust me, it's not going to work. And let's just go with, this villain monologue, whatever it may be. And hopefully your players will go along with that. But hopefully you'll also realize that most of the time you should let them use the feat that they invested in, that they took. Because them being able to grab hold of that narrative is not, it's not an assault on you. It's not them attacking you or challenging your role as a game master. It's fun. It's interesting. It's a complication that you didn't expect, or just that is going to add a layer that is maybe not what you had planned. And that's okay. That's fun. That's when some of the best stuff happens at a table. And finally, for those who are still wondering, well, why have these feats if you're just going to run it this way? Well, some GMs may not either want to or feel comfortable improvising enough to allow some of these effects that are in feats to happen without feats. And as an extension, some players may not be able to think outside the box enough, or just not be comfortable enough, shooting their ideas out there. A lot of people are, have different levels of comfort when they're playing, especially newer players. You don't want to embarrass yourself, do something silly until that trust builds. So they may not try to do a fun idea, but if they can look at their sheet and go, oh, I've got this thing, it may help. I want to help, let me use this thing. They're going to do that. So, you've got these feats that are both telling GMs, interesting ways to do things that may not come up until somebody takes the feat, for example, right? And that's what's cool about the way Pathfinder is set up, is there's a lot of rules, but they don't really get in your way. They're only there if you want to have them. If you want to role play out, or, play out with dice, full exploration, going down a rapid river and climbing a mountain and infiltrating whatever, you can do it with just your GM setting some skill check DCs, and we move along. Which is the same thing a supposedly more rules light game like 5th edition, not supposedly, it's definitely more rules light, but a game like 5th edition D&D, they're going to have you do the same thing. They're going to say, hey, roll a check. Maybe there's advantage, maybe there's disadvantage, but GM set a DC and move on. And Pathfinder 2nd Edition is telling you the same thing. It's just the rules are there if you go looking for them. And you won't go looking for a lot of them. You'll just roll on through, and that's a great way to play the game, and that's fine. But for the players that are interested in that, or who take a feat that specifically calls out a rule, you learn that rule when it comes up. And that's a great way to learn a system. So that's why those feats are there. Maybe not necessarily by design, but it's a great reason to keep them. It's a great little happy accident that you have ways to learn rules that you may not normally interact with based on seeing them on your list of feats that you can choose and taking them. The other thing is, again, as I said, you have people who are uncomfortable having those feats there. Will both encourage, it's going to encourage role play, potentially, right? Like if you know that your character is a charming liar, you might role play your character as a charming liar instead of just role playing your character as a rogue with a high deception skill. And that's interesting. That's flavor text. That's, a role play, push, and that's good and that's great. So those are my thoughts. It's just something that I've seen a lot, and we sort of touched on this in other videos, but I really, it irks me a bit when I see people who say that, as more feats get added, each skill gets less valuable because there's so many new things you can only do by having the feat. And that's not my interpretation at all. It's not the impression that I get from the developers that it's their intention. These rules, every single rule there is optional, and it's there when you need it, and the system is designed really solidly so that if you don't need that particular rule, you have myriad ways to handle it without having to jump into the book. So hey, I really recommend that if you're not doing this at your table, but you probably are, whether you realize it or not, and maybe not to this extent or whatever, but if you're not doing this at your table consciously or regularly, you should look into it and you should do it. It opens things up quite a bit more. It's going to, of course, encourage a little more outside the box thinking. Make sure that your players know that just because you don't have this feat just means that you can't necessarily do it this way. It doesn't mean that what you want to do is impossible. One thing to note, of course, if you have a player who's abusing this sort of mindset, somebody who continues to use the same couple of, abilities or tricks that exist as feats, maybe encourage them to take those feats. Say, hey, listen, you clearly enjoy doing this. If you would like to keep doing it, you should probably take this feat the next time you get a skill feat or class feat, whatever it may be. So, let me know what you think down in the comments. Is this something that you're already doing? Is it something that you're going to continue or consider doing in the future? And hey, if you think this is a really bad way to run a game, definitely let me know down in the comments as well. I definitely don't mind the criticism. I think it opens up a lot, and I think that it can really encourage players on every facet, not just mechanically, not just improv-wise, but also RP-wise and things like that. Hey, everybody, we actually have just launched a Discord server. There will be a link down in the description. So come join in. There's not a lot of people there right now. Hopefully you can change that. Come by, talk. There's, a lot of different channels to talk about different things. Get advice from fellow GMs or players on build advice. I'll definitely be in there answering some questions here and there as I have time. And we'll hopefully set up like a time when I can, let you all know that, Sarah or I will be in the chat and there to talk to you and answer questions, sort of things. Almost like little Ask Me Anythings that we want to do regularly, just to help people out with rules questions you may have, or, even just strategizing as a GM, like, hey, I've got this weird situation, that I've sort of gotten myself into. I've got a couple ideas here, but I could use some help ironing out what to do there. So anything we can do to help out and be a resource, and not just us, but the community as a whole. We're building a collective, and we really like the idea of having a place where we can all go and talk that isn't relegated to just a single comment section on a video. Not that we don't appreciate those. So definitely check out the Discord, and we hope to see you there. Welcome to the collective.